Next tonight, another in our reports on China, this time with a focus on human rights. Late today, the State Department sent its annual Worldwide Human Rights Survey to Congress. What that survey says about China's progress or lack of progress on the human rights front will affect a host of trade and political issues between China and the United States. Our report on human rights in China comes from Special Correspondent Robert Oxnam. A former president of the Asia Society, he's now with Columbia University and the Bessemer Group, a New York investment firm.
This is the image China seeks to project to the world. Prosperous, welcoming, magnanimous. Last year, the Chinese government staged elaborate ceremonies in its unsuccessful campaign to bring the Olympic Games to Beijing in the year 2000. It ceremoniously released its most famous political prisoner, Wei Jingsheng, along with several others. But this remains an image China wants to live down. The Tiananmen Square massacre, government troops gunning down pro-democracy activists. The most indelible image was this young man facing down a tank. To this day, he is unaccounted for, presumed dead or imprisoned. While many in the United States and elsewhere were outraged by the 1989 events, some in the Chinese government saw them differently, even arguing that the army did not intentionally use force in Tiananmen Square. ZHONG JIANHUI is one of China's principal spokesmen on human rights issues.
Many of the soldiers' guns had no bullets, and the tanks had no ammunition either. The tanks did not open fire. They were there only to clear the way, to push open the path. There were also some warning shots fired, which ricocheted up from the ground. Look, you saw someone walking in front of tanks, back and forth, and the tanks was avoiding him. That was a very tense time. You would think the army would open fire, but the order was not given to fire. So I see that the events at Tiananmen were exaggerated, that many events were not as had been reported.
Same images, different interpretations. That can also be said for the term human rights. When Mr. Clinton and Chinese President Jiang Zemin met last November in Seattle at the Asian Pacific Economic Summit, the American president received a 15-minute lecture on the Chinese definition of human rights. China's president also conveyed the same notion to 4 American television correspondents.
The difference between China and the United States with regard to the question of human rights is not whether there should be human rights. The difference lies in how we should view the question of human rights. For me, the most important thing is to ensure the right to subsistence of the 1.17 billion of the Chinese people. We have to ensure that they have adequate food and clothing, and their livelihood will be constantly improved.
While in Seattle, President Jiang toured Boeing aircraft, where China is a big spending customer. He also visited the home of a Boeing worker. Jiang Zemin appeared to underscore that China's emphasis on economic progress as a human right benefits U.S. workers. Despite valuable Sino-American trade of almost $35 billion in 1993, President Clinton has threatened to revoke China's most favored nation trading status if there is not substantial human rights progress. The loss of MFN, currently given to all but 12 countries, would seriously harm bilateral trade. The Clinton administration has sent several high-profile emissaries to Beijing, including Treasury Secretary Lloyd Bentsen, with a clear-cut message to speed up human rights reforms. While the Chinese tout releases of some prisoners and promise more in the future, they strongly object to U.S. interference in internal affairs.
So there is an international aspect to human rights, but primarily it is a part of a country's internal affairs. It is related to a country's conditions and should be protected by the laws of a country. So it is primarily a matter of a country's internal affairs.
Some in the U.S. business community argue that economic development advances human rights. Virginia Kamsky is a consultant to American companies who do business in China.
Trade is allowing China to develop. Their economy is booming. As the economy booms, there's more money. When there's more money, there's more education. Does education promote human rights? Of course it does.
Robin Monroe of Asia Watch, a human rights advocacy group, rejects China's emphasis on economic growth as the highest priority.
The argument that economic rights take priority over human rights in a developing country, I think, is really a red herring. It is not relevant. I mean, I don't see why a country should feel that it has to arrest dissidents and torture them in order to guarantee economic progress. I think the argument that the Chinese government puts in the UN and other bodies that human rights are an internal affair, China has its own standards of human rights, it has culturally different ones. These are all excuses made by tyrants, I'm afraid. They do not hold water. The Chinese government can perfectly well continue economic reform and at the same time stop arresting political dissidents and stop torturing detainees in Chinese prisons.
And that's basically the U.S. position as well. At the Seattle summit, President Clinton said he pressed the following issues with President Jiang Zemin: the release of political prisoners, prison inspections by the Red Cross, a genuine dialogue on the autonomous region of Tibet, and prohibiting exports of goods made by prison labor. For openers, the Chinese government disputes the numbers of those left in prison from the 1989 Tiananmen demonstrations. Official figures of 70 still imprisoned differ sharply from a list of about 1,300 compiled by human rights groups like Asia Watch. Beijing leaders ignore or dismiss many of the charges that prisoners are mistreated. Western critics rarely glimpse prison life in China, so they are forced to rely on anecdotal evidence. For example, an American tourist videotaped this public humiliation of prisoners on the streets of Shanghai last year. Dissidents who slip out of China tell of abuse and torture. We met this family in Hong Kong just before they relocated to Europe. Mo Li, a teacher from Hunan province, was in Beijing in 1989. She says she was only chaperoning her students. She left just before the Chinese troops opened fire.
Then, after the massacre of Beijing, we got the news. It was too shocking to me, too unbearable, and I thought I had to speak out. I made public speeches critical of the government.
For criticizing the government, Mo Li was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Her husband lost his job. Another political prisoner, Fan Zhong, says he received even worse treatment.
The People's Armed Police officers ordered me to kneel first on the cell floor, and I refused to do that, so they beat me up quite badly. They said, write a confession, and I refused, so the police officer put out an electric baton and started giving me shocks with it. When I still did not write a confession at that point, they put me on the shackleboard. They told me to write my confession before they would release me. They locked me on the shackleboard for more than 10 days.
Despite such graphic descriptions, Chinese government denies that torture is allowed.
We have always been opposed to the use of torture in prisons. And in fact, we have laws which prohibit torture. In this area, we have rights. First of all, we respect their personal dignity. We respect their personal safety. This is all stipulated by our laws. So the question of torture does not exist.
But the accounts of torture make access to prisons by humanitarian groups a key factor in U.S. assessments of China's human rights record. China's government recently agreed to consider letting the International Committee of the Red Cross inspect prisons on a regular basis. Negotiations to work out the details and timing have begun, with no clear resolution in sight. Many participants of the Tiananmen Square demonstrations who fled China now want to return home without fear of reprisal. Chai Ling was a student leader in 1989. Branded a counter-revolutionary, she escaped by hiding beneath a truck. Last June, at a demonstration on the 4th anniversary of Tiananmen, she confronted security guards in front of the Chinese embassy in Washington. She demanded to leave a letter requesting safe passage back to China.
The chancery here is closed for the evening.
Uh-huh.
There's no one coming to the door.
Right.
And we're just standing right here.
And then what are you going to do with the letter?
You gave me one.
Oh, I'm not giving it to you. I'm giving it to the Chinese government.
Chai Ling has also asked the U.S. government to press her case.
We want to go home with safety and dignity, and the citizen's right to go to his own home country is a basic human right.
If she cannot return, she insists the Chinese government permit her family members to leave China. U.S. officials say how the Chinese handle immigration requests will be a measure of overall progress on human rights. Evidence that China was using prison labor to manufacture exports was raised by Harry Wu, a Chinese dissident who served 19 years in the Chinese prison system. In 1991, he returned to China with a hidden camera, videotaping dozens of prisons and forced labor sites, including places where he was imprisoned. Wu insists that prison-made goods continue to be illegally exported to the U.S. in violation of existing trade agreements.
It is very common practice. Chinese have the biggest enterprises of slavery in our 20th century because there's 10 million people in agricultural camps, in mining camps, in industrial camps.
The U.S.-China Business Council claims the amount of prison-made exports to this country is negligible.
Even given the highest volume of exports from prison labor, it couldn't possibly exceed a fraction of 1%.
On his recent visit, Treasury Secretary BENTSEN spoke of continuing progress on this issue.
Our governments have agreed on measures to ensure more effective prevention of the export of goods made with prison labor. China has also agreed to permit inspections of 5 prisons alleged to be producing goods for export.
An issue of growing concern to many Americans is freedom of religion. With the decline of the communist ideology, the Chinese are once again visiting shrines and temples to practice traditional religions such as Taoism and Buddhism. Christian faiths are also attracting new followers. But religious activity is still carefully monitored. Many dissidents have been incarcerated for challenging the authority of the regime. While services like this Mass can generally be held openly, sources in the Roman Catholic Church contend that 3 bishops and some 200 priests remain imprisoned, and that more clergymen have been arrested recently. China is also accused of suppressing the religion and culture of Tibet, which it forcibly occupied in the 1950s. Its spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, lives in exile in India. In Tibet, he is still worshipped as a near god. Tibet is considered by the Chinese to be an official part of China. Even though martial law was recently repealed and Tibet is open to tourism, religious and cultural expression there is stifled, according to human rights activist Robin Monroe.
Tibet remains one of the most brutal and tragic parts of China. There are hundreds of peaceful Tibetan pro-independence activists, often monks or nuns, rotting in Chinese prisons today. Many of them received sentences over 10 years. The brutality and torture in prisons in Tibet is probably worse than in any other part of China. Horrific tortures, people hung up by the wrists and left to hang there for days. Sexual abuse of detained nuns, for example.
In spite of such reports, Chinese President Jiang Zemin said in Seattle last fall that Tibetans receive fair treatment.
Tibet all along has been an inalienable part of China. Since the PRC's founding, Tibet has been an autonomous region of China. The Tibetan people fully enjoy autonomy in accordance with the organic laws of the Tibetan region.
All these issues will weigh on President Clinton when he decides this spring whether to continue China's MFN status in its present form. Some in his own party argue that human rights must take priority in U.S.-China relations.
I believe that human rights are universal, that we have to say, if we support human rights, that we have to support it in every country of the world, and we can't give the benefits of our markets in a preferential way to people who are repressing their own people and profiting off of the trade.
Other Democrats say MFN is not an appropriate tool for influencing human rights.
To encourage China to make much more progress on human rights, we should use many of the different tools that are available to us, that is, tools that are tailored much more closely to the problem. That is, not revoke our common trading status with them, because if were we to do so, the results would be cataclysmic for China and for the United States.
The business community fears losing trade with the world's fastest growing economy as they push for MFN renewal.
You're talking now about $9 billion of U.S. exports to China. Will the Chinese retaliate if MFN is rescinded? I have absolutely no doubt that they will retaliate.
In this crossfire of commercial and moral concerns, Washington looks for progress.
We have not, in my judgment, made enough progress to justify my saying that there's been significant overall progress. Nevertheless, this is an important step in the path to the improvement of U.S.-China relations.
Ultimately, the issue of greater opening in China rests with the leadership in Beijing, today and after the succession to its aged paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. The Chinese have shown skill at casting off socialism for a rapidly modernizing economy with capitalist incentives. Now they face the challenge of casting off the remnants of authoritarianism for greater protection of individual rights.